into the most famous American soldier of World War I. It's being given by Dr. Michael Birdwell and Dr. Tom Nolan. Dr. Birdwell is Associate Professor of History at Tennessee Technological University. He's also a film historian, and he is the archivist of the Alvin C. York Papers. Tom Nolan is director of the Laboratory for Spatial Technology at Middle Tennessee State University. He's a geographer with special interest in battlefield mapping, and his dissertation is the results of the Sergeant York archaeology near Chatel-Chéhéry, France. And also a note that he is a former quartermaster in the Coast Guard, serving on Coast Guard cutter Unimac, which is now Razor Blades. Please welcome Dr. Mike Birdwell and Dr. Tom Nolan. Thank you.
Okay, this is going to be tag team history. I'm Michael Birdwell, and I should give you a little bit of background of why that I am qualified to do this. I've been the archivist of Alvin York's papers since 1996, and have been working on Alvin York material and working with the York family since 1987. So 20 years of my life has been consumed with Alvin York, and I get phone calls. I said photographs, they pull out the cameras, Freudian slip. I get phone calls, emails literally on a daily basis about Alvin York, and I know things about him that his family don't know, but there are still lots of things that are yet to be learned. And Taylor Beatty, I met Taylor, I guess, 1998. Met Taylor in 1998, and he came to the York site and gave a presentation about his research in France and trying to locate exactly where Alvin York walked into history on October the 8th. And Taylor and I have been friends ever since. And we've often said we need to go to the ravine together someday and open a bottle of wine. Tom Nolan and I, we've known each other roughly the same amount of time. In fact, Tom and I first met at a WFA conference, and then he did some maps for 2 different books that I wrote and then worked and edited. And Tom calls one day and says, after having read Taylor's article, he said, we ought to go map it. And so this is how this whole thing got started. Just simply from Taylor writing an article in Army history, and then Tom wanting to map it, and let's see if there are any artifacts left over. So what we have is this merging of history and geography. It's a happy marriage between history and science. And it's been an adventure, to say the least. Most people don't know what Alvin York looks like. This is in 3 different presentations today, Alvin York has come up. So you're becoming familiar with Alvin York. That, of course, is Alvin on the my right-hand side of the screen, and Gary Cooper on the left. They bear no resemblance, but for most people, Gary Cooper is Alvin York. There are similarities. Gary Cooper and Alvin York, were both 6'3", 185 pounds. Well, that's when York was in the Army, and when Cooper made the film, they were both 6'3", 185. York was actually 300 pounds when the film was being made. Go to the next slide. This is a little-known picture of York, and I just want to step back a minute and tell you about the Alvin York you're probably not familiar with. How many people have seen the movie? How many people, how many people here is the movie your basic conception of who Sergeant York was? And you've been led astray, led down the garden path. I don't have the time today, and it's not the forum to tell you everything that's wrong with the movie, but I will shamelessly plug my book, Celluloid Soldiers, Warner Brothers Campaign Against Nazism, because chapters 4 and chapter 5 go out and tell you exactly what's wrong with the movie, point by point. For example, how many people here have been to Pall Mall? 3 people, 4, Taylor and Tom. All of Pall Mall is bottom land. So that is a bogus plot line in the entire movie. Well, background about York that is important, that is necessary to what we want to discuss today. York was born December 13th, 1887 in a 2-room dog trot log cabin in Pall Mall in the valley of the Three Forks of the Wolf River. He was the 3rd child to William and Mary York, who had 11 children. And so York grows up in a quasi-frontier experience. He learned to fire a gun at the age of 7, and that gun was a muzzle loader. And he learned to shoot with a muzzle loader. And over the course of his life, his youth, he became well known as quite a good shot. And he was patient. That's very important. York was an incredibly patient man, and his patience is going to pay off on October the 8th, 1918. When York was 14 years old, his 2 older brothers, Joe and Henry, had moved away, and York's father was killed. He was kicked in the head by a mule and died of brain fever. That's what they called it, brain fever, brain hemorrhage. And at the tender age of 14, York now has to be in charge of the entire family. That's not in the movie at all. And at the age of 14, here you got this guy who's trying to take care of the family in this rural existence, and as he said, I broke the bone dry law, and he starts drinking moonshine because that's all that's really available. Both Tennessee and Kentucky were dry by the time he's 14 years old, and so he starts drinking moonshine and so-called blind tigers. He is headed down a life of dissipation. He gets a reputation for being a real hellion, and moonshine and firearms are not necessarily the best combination, but it is a muzzle loader, so it takes longer. So you can maybe calm down a little bit. And in 1914, a tragic event took place when York's best friend, Everett Delk, was killed in a barroom fight somewhere on the Tennessee-Kentucky border. We're not even exactly sure where, but near Static, Kentucky. And York has to bring the body home. And he said that, it mussed him up right smart. And I dare say to anybody in this room that if you were in a questionable situation and your best friend was killed and you've got to take the body home and face the family, that would shake you up somewhat. And so it is that event that will lead to York's religious conversion in 1915, in January of 1915. And he became a member of the Church of Christ and Christian Union, which probably means nothing to anybody here. Has anybody even heard of it? I didn't think so. It only exists in 3 states. Its headquarters are Circleville, Ohio. There are a couple of congregations in Kentucky, and there's 1 congregation in Tennessee. That's it. That's also why York could not get conscientious objector status. It is not a legitimate denomination. So, York's draft notice comes in 1917, and York's religion says he's not supposed to fight, not supposed to kill, and he has to face this situation. Do I go to jail because I'm not a conscientious objector, or do I go fight? And to put this in perspective for you for a second, I know you guys don't know Tennessee geography, and so I can't use landmarks that would mean anything to you from that point of view, but York is 29 years old when he's drafted. York has never been on a city sidewalk. York has never ridden in an automobile. York has never been more than 50 miles from his home. And we're going to pick this guy up and drop him in Paris, and then other points in Europe. If the death of Everett Delk is the first signal event in York's life, then World War I, just as it set the tone for the rest of the 20th century, World War I shapes York forever. It is the crucible that changed him. It is the crucible of war that made him different. This is a very rare photo of York. This is one that we have at the site. This has never been published. And it's an image of York there at home in Pall Mall with his slouch hat, and he's got the 3 medals he's most proud of, and his whistle. You'll also notice, and this is why this slide is up here. Notice the collar disc. The collar disc, which says 328, then you've got the cross rifles, so infantry, and G. York belonged to 328th Infantry, Company G, 82nd Division. Notice the 82nd Division is missing in this room, which I'd like to know the answer to that if somebody knows. That's a key piece of evidence, that little collar disc right there. And you'll see more of that in a moment. Next slide. This is what Alvin York looked like in 1940 when he's getting ready to sign the contract with Gary Cooper. This is actually in a hotel in Nashville, Tennessee. This is March the 23rd, 1940, and they don't look anything alike. One of York's relatives like to say that there's a huge difference between Alvin York and Gary Cooper, because Cooper could, if you ask him a question, be yep or nope. York, he said, could talk the ears off a field of corn. So York was a voluble man. York was also a real cut-up. He loved practical jokes. That doesn't come across with Cooper. Next. This is the portrait of York that you see most often. He's come back home to Tennessee. This is taken in front of his mother's house. This was taken by a man by the name of Hines from Nashville. And York is trying to come to grips with having become famous for something that happened on October the 8th, 1918. Now, we're going to go into some specifics, especially when Tom comes up here and starts with the mapping. But when reading Taylor's article, Taylor said that he was trying to find out where York did his thing, looking at this stuff from the perspective of a professional soldier. Well, we wanted to also corroborate what Taylor did, but then try to look at it as it works with the primary documents at hand. How do the existing maps line up? How do historic maps and conventional maps, how can we go in and pinpoint what took place? Well, in order to do that, we needed to get permission from the French government to go in and dig. You can't just go in willy-nilly into France with your entrenching tools. You can't do that. They'll seize your car. They've got a hefty fine. So Tom led the charge in getting the permissions from the French government so that we could go in there and dig. We also knew that Tom and I alone couldn't do this. It was going to take more than us. And so Fred Castier, who you've heard a lot about, you're going to see a picture of him in a moment, Fred Castier agreed to act as our interpreter. Michael Kelly, who's a part of Bartlett's Battlefield Journeys and is an excellent historian, Michael Kelly agreed to work out logistics for us on the ground and provide ground transportation and also provide the entrenching tools and things of that nature. And so it is an international team. Yves de Fossé, who is the regional archaeologist, and there are only two archaeologists in France who specialize on World War I archaeology, Yves de Fossé and Alain Jacques. They agreed to help. In our second trip, we had a Belgian archaeologist, Berger Stiekelbo, and another Tennessean who came on board, Jim Deppen. Next. This is also a rare photo of York. This is when York returns from this is in New York. He looks afraid. If you look at his eyes, if you've seen those other photographs, he looks quite calm. But Germans may not scare him, but New Yorkers did. And that's also part of the controversy surrounding York, because and Taylor is working on this, and I know about this tangentially, but if you look at the folks who York was involved with, if you look at the 17 men from Company G who left on that early cold morning of October the 8th, all of them, with the exception of Murray Savage and York, are from the north and are from urban areas. And so there's this rural urban bias going on, and that's something that Taylor's going to flesh out later. But he's actually going to see these crazy. And the thing in the movie where he says that he wants to ride on the subway because of his friend Pusher who was killed, there was no guy Pusher. That guy was made up entirely. York really did ask. When the mayor gave him the key to the city, he said, "What would you like to do?" He literally did say, "I'd like to take a ride on a subway," because he'd never seen one, and they thought he was a lunatic for that. So there are some little things in the movie that are correct. Go ahead. This is it. This is heading down from Chatel-Chéhéry into the ravine where Company G engaged on October the 8th, 1918. For those of you who've been to Tennessee, this looks amazingly like the area around York's home. York is at home in October the 8th, 1918. And I do believe that those instincts that he'd learned as a kid from hunting just kicked in during this firefight. That those natural instincts that had been pounded into him by his father of how to use the terrain to your advantage comes to bear here. And keep in mind, on that morning of October the 8th, it's cold, it's raining, it's foggy like this, and this, is similar to what York would have seen, except it was colder than what he would have seen on October the 8th. Next. That's going down the road, headed towards the ravine. Go back in here, and then right back in there. Yeah. Okay, here we are getting ready to go in. This is we made 2 trips last year. We made our first trip in March, and we made our second trip in November. On your left is Michael Kelly, the Brit that I mentioned earlier, and then this is Tom in his GPSing regalia, and he'll explain more of that to you in a moment. Yeah. This is Fred Castier on my left. Fred, the interpreter, and then that's Yves de Fossé, the archaeologist, on the other side, the guy with the pipe. Then you've seen one of these guys before. Actually, you've seen Tom before. This is Damien Georges, who Taylor mentioned. This is the mayor of Fléville. He is the regional forester, and he was absolutely crucial in helping us understand some of the land features. For example, you'll see in a moment, there's a depression that looks like a trench, but it's not. It's actually it's a land boundary, and we mistook it for a trench. The man in the middle is Roland Destiné. He is the mayor of Chatel-Chéhéry. That's the print. Does that not look like a trench to you? And yet this is a boundary marker. This is a boundary marker that goes back to the 11th century. This was a Cistercian monastery is just down the road, and this was used as a boundary between public land and private land. It has been maintained. Louis XIV also said that these boundary markers to be maintained, and the Germans did indeed use it as a fortification, but it's a boundary marker. And you can see how we made that mistake, saying, this is the German trench. Well, no, it's the boundary marker that the Germans used as a defensive position. On our second trip, we had more help. Our second trip, we went in to try to better focus our direction of what we were looking. Our first trip was somewhat disappointing. We didn't find everything we thought we should have, and we found only a handful of objects compared to what we found the second go around. In fact, it wasn't until the next to the last day that we started finding any American artifacts. And so we decided that when we went back in November, we needed a larger team and we needed more time in the field. And so we had the help of the folks mentioned before, but this is right here. This is Eddie Hobbs, who's from Britain, and then that's Berger Stickelbo beside him. You can see the steepness of the hill, and that's looking down into the valley down below. You can see how we have flagged areas where there are artifacts. Every artifact that we've uncovered, we flagged it, we took a photograph of it in situ, and then we took a second photograph of it when we got it back to the gîte, and then they were all given discrete numbers. We found over 1,500 artifacts in all. One thing that we wanted to try to locate were the graves of the 6 Americans who died on October the 8th. We knew that 4 of them had been buried together, and the best chance to try to find any of the graves was try to find the 4 together. And the French, at their own expense, agreed to provide us with a backhoe. And that was actually invaluable, because it is the backhoe that led us to make one of the most significant discoveries that we made the entire time. This shows you the distribution of where we think the American casualties should be. So pull it out? Okay. All right, that will show the distribution of where the casualties were. But if you'll notice what Roland is holding, that is a collar disc that we would not have found had it not been for the backhoe. The French said that we couldn't dig any more than 4 inches, and most of the things that we found were very near the surface of the ground. And that's me in the funky hat, and there's Tom and Michael Kelly, Fred Castier, Yves de Fosse, Roland Destiné. The backhoe was digging slit trenches, and we were going through and then checking to see in the debris what's there. And Michael Kelly found a very faint signal, and this signal's, it's deep, it's very faint, and I digged this thing up. I don't know what I thought it was just a tunic button, and handed over to Jim Deppen, who was washing it off in the creek, and he starts screaming, 328, 328, 328, G, 328. And we knew we had something special. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Tom now.
I thought you were going to do this. Oh.
I thought you were doing it.
Oh. This is supposedly part of the history part, but I guess I have to talk about it. How's this thing in there? This is actually a map of the attack of the 2nd Battalion, 328th Infantry on the 8th of October, 1918. And of course, York's unit was G Company. And G Company occupied the left flank on the 2nd Battalion attack frontage. And York's platoon was the far left platoon on the left flank of G Company. This red area is the area that was covered by the G Company attack. It started from here from Hill 223. Their objective was a narrow gauge railway, usually referred to as a Decaville railway, that the Germans were using to supply positions to the south of that, particularly the area involved in the Lost Battalion. Their job was to sever that railway and cause the Germans to retreat, which they did successfully. All right. Ruh-roh. Ruh-roh.
Okay.
Oh, this is still your stuff.
He's right, I didn't step that. Sorry.
My point?
This is Dr. Sam Barnes. And this past year, just last month, Pall Mall and Chatel-Chéhéry were made sister villages. And Sam Barnes is working on a bust of Alvin York that will be dedicated in France next year. And then now you can see the clay model. Yeah, I guess so. I don't do tech stuff. And you can see, this is a life-size bust, and go to the next one so they can see what the clay looks like. And Sam has used the collar disc that we dug up. He got an impression of it. I guess with artifacts just next to it.
Yep, it's the Medal of Honor.
There's the Medal of Honor citation. Can you read it? Do I need to read it to you?
Come on.
Okay. This is where Tom starts. So. Sorry about the computer.
Well, this is sort of the model that we followed in terms of the research design. The idea was that there was a historical component, records, written accounts, historic maps, those kinds of things that describe the York fight. And then there also would be some artifactual records, some artifacts left from the York fight. And geographic information systems was a technology that allows you to take information from a variety of sources at a variety of scales and transform it all into a single scale so you could compare things at their locations. And then from that comparison and analysis, we could have a more complete interpretation of the York fight than was available before. Okay. And Michael talked about the process of getting the permit from the French regional archaeologists, and this is indeed a copy of the permit we had to have to stay out of jail. There were several sources of spatial data, both in the narrative form where people gave descriptions of where they were in relation to landscape features. There were several annotated maps. There are also spatial information included in the burial records of the 6 soldiers who were killed there. There were map coordinates of their initial grave locations, and then there were also information that was recorded by the Graves Registration Service when they disinterred the bodies to move them to the National Cemetery. There was also cartographic information from both the French maps that the American forces used and German maps that were captured during the war of this area. So what that allowed us to do was build a landscape model of the area around Chatel-Chéhéry as it existed in 1918. The vegetative cover pattern, the road network, where these narrow gauge railways were, all the factors that were referred to in the documentary evidence. In 1929, the Army War College hosted a benefit, and part of that was going to be a reenactment of the York fight. And a Captain Swindler with the Army War College was tasked with developing a narrative to guide the reenactment. And he went through the existing records and was unable to reach any conclusion about what happened. So he engaged in a correspondence with G. Edward Buxton, who had been York's battalion commander and was later the 82nd Division historian, and Captain Danforth, who was his company commander. And what he did is he sent letters to both of those officers and asked them to answer some specific questions about what happened. And he also sent them a copy of the French 1 to 20,000 trench map and requested they annotate their memories on that map. And this is a copy of the map that that Swindler sent. He sent it first to Buxton. Buxton returned it to him with his notations on it. Then he sent the same map to Danforth and asked him to record his recollections, and also he answered some narrative questions.